question before the jury is this: who crucified Jesus? Shall we be quick to point the finger so that the blame won't fall upon us? In a sense, do we not share the responsibility? Are we not part of the factors in a society that crucify the best in any age, whether it be the dawn of Christianity or the explosion of the 20th century? Good evening. The program is Challenge. It brings together a rabbi, a minister, and a priest. They offer their counsel to many of the challenges we face in today's complicated world. Tonight they explore the subject, who crucified Jesus? Now, may I introduce the Catholic, Father William Tracy, Director of the Catholic Information Center. The Rabbi, Raphael Levine, Senior Rabbi of the Temple de Hirsch. And the minister, Dr. Martin Goslin, pastor of the Plymouth Congregational Church.
Thank you, Don. As we enter what the Christians call Holy Week, it is well for us to stop tonight and consider this question of who crucified Jesus. Across the ages, this has stood as one of the tragic moments in all of human history. A crime perpetrated against the best, and yet as we look at it across these nearly 2,000 years, we are conscious that the same elements are in our society today, which basically were the cause of the crucifixion of Jesus. So tonight, as the three of us talk about the place of the responsibility, I hope that you will understand that we are conscious always of our own problems in our life today in relationship to that tragic event so many centuries ago. As we think about those who were involved in this affair, we know that the Pharisees and Sadducees had their part. We also know that the imperial government had its place. We know that a king, Herod Antipas, was responsible in a way, as was Judas, the disciple of Jesus, the crowd that took part in the last scenes before the cross, and the soldiers who actually carried out the crucifixion. But the people of the city were not without responsibility too. Who crucified Jesus? That's the question that is before us. Father Tracy and Rabbi Levine, I'm sure that you too have your opinions as to the responsibility, and it is in this regard that we should talk tonight.
I think so. I think, first of all, I'm very happy to sit down and discuss this with you and with Rabbi Levine. I think it's a mark of tolerance to the fullest, in spite of all the emotionalism that has surrounded this thing and the relations of Jews and Christians in the past, that we can sit down here tonight and calmly discuss this. The trial of Christ is a more emotional one in a way than the trial of Dreyfus, or the trial of Joan of Arc, or the trial of Socrates, or any of the other great trials in history, because Christ claimed to be God. And today, millions of years later, thousands of years later, he is regarded by millions of people as having validly established that claim. So in the course of tonight's discussion, I, for one, would like to go back to the remark of the first Pope when he was speaking to the Jews, some of them who may have been present at the death of Christ, St. Peter, when he said in the 3rd chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, "I know that you acted in ignorance, as did your rulers, that the trial of Christ is a continuing thing, and no century must disassociate itself from it, or no people."
That's true, and I would like to suggest in this connection that if we can possibly place ourselves in the frame of reference of people who lived during that period 2,000 years ago, and realize, first of all, that to those people there was no recognition of what Jesus ultimately became in the Christian tradition.
Not even among his disciples.
No, not even among his disciples. And to them, he was, to most of them, I would say, he was just another rabbi who was traveling through the country preaching and teaching. And some of the things he taught, some people liked very much. And some, of course, didn't like because he said some things that were against the status quo, against the vested interests of certain authorities in ancient Judea. And if we recognize that it was a situation in a particular environment and try to see it from the point of view of the people living at that time, I think we would understand the whole situation much better.
In most of our Christian teachings, we are conscious of the fact that the Jews are played up as the villains of this story. And this is rather tragic because we know, for instance, that the strongest sect among the Jews of Jesus' day were the Pharisees. Basically, they were heirs to the very best in Judaism. They were the followers of a noble army of martyrs who 2 centuries before had been the Hasidim, the pious ones, who had been able to withstand the persecutions of Syrian rulers. But they had sought out the best in law and tradition and consequently had tried to organize this in such a way, legalize it, so that if you followed the legal pattern, you were acceptable. If not, you were not acceptable. And possibly because Jesus refused to fall into this pattern, their rejection of him was complete.
Of course, there's something a little different about the death of Christ that leads to misunderstanding, and that is the fact that, as St. Peter had pointed out on that occasion, that everything about him had been foretold, that it might have been possible to identify him and to recognize him as such. And that's a problem to people at the present time. If it was foretold and preordained, how does that fit in with free will?
Well, this, of course, is one of the very complex theological problems which I doubt whether a television program like this would permit us to enter into.
Perhaps a little story would illustrate it, how if you look on God as the master weaver, how he can still use people to achieve his purpose without interfering with their free will. Because they say we're not trying to pin responsibility on the Jews, as we'll see as this develops along the lines you indicated, Dr. Goslin. It's a continuing thing. And any race or any group of people or any individual could make a similar decision.
May I just make one comment here, gentlemen? You know, it's very interesting that people don't sometimes recognize that everybody involved in the situation were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. All his disciples were Jews. The people who were against him were Jews, and the people who were for him were Jews. And those of you who have seen the film Ben-Hur get some picture of the situation, at least as a dramatist would try to express it. When he was led to the cross, you remember the people standing on the sidelines weeping to see this innocent man led to his execution? Now, all these people standing on the sideline were Jews.
Well, of course, that's right. The Irish have a great devotion to St. Patrick, Rabbi Levine, as you know, for bringing them the faith. And March 17th, I'll let no one else forget that. But the other thing that we must remember is that if it wasn't for the devout Jews who accepted Christ, it wouldn't have been possible for St. Patrick to bring them the faith.
No, the whole of the early Christian church was Jewish. In fact, it was only under St. Paul that it was led out into the Gentile world. But what about this other group, the Sadducees, the rather elite churchmen, the broad-minded traditionalists, the culturally elite of this community? I have an idea that they were not unlike some of the people of our day. They felt that any change was dangerous. They looked upon Jesus as a radical, a subversive. They were probably afraid of the threat that he would destroy the temple. They were politicians, as many people with vested interest are, and they were looking to their own particular little bailiwick to keep it protected. We have people like that today who are willing to sacrifice principles and ideals for the protection of their own little nook and cranny.
That's true. I mean, it's true not just of rulers, it's true of the average individual. We have a devotion that probably Dr. Goslin is familiar with. You may not be familiar with unless you have visited a Catholic church, Rabbi Levine, and seen those paintings on the walls. They're called the Stations of the Cross. We meditate on 14 incidents in the life of Christ, leading from his condemnation to the crucifixion. And here's just one little brief meditation that we make. It's composed by Bishop Sheehan before the first station that brings out that point of Dr. Goslin's, that It's not so much the Sadducees or the Pharisees or Herod or anybody else that crucified Christ. He said, "My conscience is the tribunal of Pilate. Daily, hourly, and every minute of the day, Christ comes before that tribunal as virtue, honesty, and purity. Barabbas comes as vice, dishonesty, and uncleanliness. As often as I choose to speak the uncharitable word, to do the dishonest action, or consent to the evil thought, I say in so many words, release unto me Barabbas." And to choose Barabbas means to crucify Christ.
And this goes on day in and day out. I mean, this is a thing that we fall into inevitably, and our choices, simple and unimportant though they may be.
Dr. Goslin, I would like to make a comment on what Father Tracy just quoted. I think that's a beautiful thing that you have just now quoted. When you said that whenever we choose the wrong, the vicious, the hateful,
That's right.
that we are actually choosing Barabbas, as you say, instead of Christ. In other words, Christ represents the symbol of everything that you Christians certainly regard as the true, the beautiful, and the good, and the holy. And every time any of us, Christian or Jew, expresses a hateful thought toward another person, we are in a very real sense crucifying goodness and truth and beauty.
You're not preaching Judaism, you're preaching Christianity.
no,
now.
no,
Be
I'm
careful.
preaching-
Judaism at its best.
At
yes,
its best.
no, I'm preaching
Excuse me,
yes,
Judaism
I'm
at its
preaching
best.
Judaism, Father Tracy, because actually we have a very lovely thought that's very similar in our tradition. May I tell it to you? It's a kind of a poetic fancy. It says that God has a cup in front of him, and every time man's inhumanity to man is expressed in hate, or in war, or in anger, or in persecution, God sheds a tear, and it falls into that cup. And this lovely tradition says that when this cup is full to overflowing with the tears that God sheds because of suffering humanity, then the Redeemer will come. Which actually expresses very much the thought that you expressed, Father
they're
Tracy,
very
in a
similar.
different way.
Rabbi Levine, and just to add one other final thought to it from one of our greatest theologians, not Bishop Sheehan, in a book of his which is probably known to millions of people because it is regarded as one of his bestsellers. It is Life of Christ. It's now available in paperback. But commenting on the crucifixion of Christ, he sums it up in a few sentences like this. It's in agreement with what you said. The guilt for the crucifixion is not to be fixed upon any one nation, race, people, or individual. Sin was the cause of the crucifixion, and all mankind had inherited the infection of sin. Jew and Gentile shared in the guilt, but what is more important is that both share in the fruits of the redemption. Now, that point that it's wrong for us to try and pinpoint extra blame on the Sadducees, the Pharisees. They all had a role to play, and to some extent they represent individuals at the present time. But I don't think we can, as Christians...
Well, this is a continuing experience, but as we look back across the centuries, we find in certain aspects of that which took place some of the things that we can also notice in the life of the day in which we live. For instance, the imperial government, represented in a sense by Pilate, was partially responsible. The overrule of any people by another people is bad for both parties. And yet today, across the world, we have many incidents where this is true. We find this trouble cropping up today in Africa because of the basic idea of colonialism, which is wrong when one people dominates another people. But when you look at Pilate, you realize that he would have released Jesus through expediency because he didn't want to get involved. He tried to shift the responsibility by sending him to Herod Antipas to have him pass sentence on him. But when it came right down to the final decision, Pilate's loyalty was primarily to Caesar rather than to the ideas of justice or righteousness. And he was scared of losing his own position. Now, we are conscious of this constantly in the world about us that when a man is pushed into a corner where a decision has to be made on principle, if possible, he oftentimes will put the principle behind him for his own advantage.
Unfortunately.
Well, one of the great challenging things about the subject that's under discussion between us tonight, who crucified Christ, is how we present the answer on which we are more or less agreed on here to the young, immature child, say, of the first grader and so on. That's one of the great things that's causing uneasiness in the minds of Christians today, that they feel that some of the misunderstandings towards the Jews that have happened in the past may have been the seeds of the prejudice may have been sown in those early years. Back in 1947 in France, a noted French Jewish historian by the name of Jules Isaac began a life of Christ. No, I should say Jesus and Israel is the title of his book. Part of it was written in the homes of Protestant ministers when he was in hiding from the Nazis, part with priests. And in this book, he analyzed some of the presentations that he came across of this story. He also had an audience with Pope Pius XII in 1947, and he presented him with this book. And it caused quite a bit of misgivings in France, so much so that there is a special commission now studying the catechisms used in the French schools. And in 1960, as a result of this book, a new catechism called Jesus and the People of the Bible was produced to try and present a more understanding picture of the role of the Jews in the crucifixion of Christ. Because they say we as mature people can understand their role, but it's very important not to label them as a nation or as a race to the little child who reads their role in the crucifixion story.
Thank you very much, Father Tracy, for making that statement. I think it's a great statement. I think it's a brave statement. And I think it's a statement that's urgently needed in our world. And I don't know whether I would be accused of
Advertising?
advertising, but I would like to recommend to our viewing public an article in Look magazine of March the 14th by Bishop Pike, the Episcopal Bishop of the San Francisco Diocese. He calls it The Roots of Bias, and it's a review of a book written by Dr. Olson, a Protestant minister, who has studied exactly what you have said about prejudiced teaching, unwittingly sometimes,
That's right.
unconsciously sometimes, in Protestant Sunday school textbooks. And the book is coming out, I think, in the autumn, and it's going to be called Victims and Oppressors, Intergroup Relations in Protestant Curricula. And you tell me now that the Catholic Church is doing the same thing for Catholic textbooks?
Well, I think that article points out that St. Louis University is conducting a special study of our textbooks, and I also will refer to the fact that we have a chair of studies, Judeo-Christian Studies at Seton Hall University. But the French hierarchy in 1952 produced a study as a result of this book by Jules Isaac with an introduction by Cardinal Saliège, and as a result many catechisms were withdrawn, and this new one that was published last year came out.
I dare say there's the same kind of need in Judaism and probably an action underway.
There is, may I say, there is. At Dropsy College, they're studying Jewish textbooks to eliminate whatever prejudice Jews may have against other people.
We're all guilty of this,
course we are.
regardless of our particular background, for we can do this so easily by using a word like Jew. It can be, for us, an epithet, just as Mick can be, or as whatever you call us Protestants. We use the words Dagos or Gringos or a half a dozen words that are common to us all, and they are derogatory. This kind of thing carries on our bias or prejudice across the years. But looking at some of the other aspects of the crucifixion, I think it's well for us to realize that the man who perpetrated it directly, Judas, is to be found constantly in the society of which we are a part today, the disillusioned idealist. We have repeated incidents of people who have betrayed their country, primarily because the objectives that they hoped for or were working for seem to be frustrated. And in sort of a rebound, they turn around and come back and say, well, if they won't do it my way, I'll force the issue. We have people like that in our own community. If things don't go their way, they have no part in it. They fuss.
May I say in this connection, in the Last Supper, forgive me for
Sure,
encroaching upon your territory,
That's all right, Rabbi Levine.
but in the Last Supper...
There was a group of Jewish boys.
Yes, I was just going to say that when Jesus was with his disciples, one of them betrayed him, Judas.
Mm-hmm.
But there were 11 other Jews who were his followers, lovers, people who looked to him as their Redeemer, Lord and Master.
That's why we must, it was one of the popes, Pope Pius XI, who said, spiritually we are Semites. We have Abraham as our father. One of the most encouraging things of the present time is the movement for greater understanding between the Jew and the Christian. That there have been mistakes certainly on the Christian side. I don't know about the Jewish side. I'm listening in the past. A misunderstanding, but one of the bright things is that even though Christ is still a dividing point between us, yet we can agree in his spirit, which is also the fulfillment of the law, namely in a spirit of charity on our differences.
That's right.
What about the aspect of the mob in the scene of the crucifixion? Obviously, it was the pressure of a group of people shouting for their desires that produced, at least on Pilate, who had the final word, the decision to crucify Jesus.
You know how, may I explain how I understand that mob?
Sure.
You notice they chose Barabbas instead of Jesus. Now, as we study the history of that period, this is the way we see it. You know, there were four parties in ancient Judea. You pointed out two of them, the Sadducees, the aristocrats, the Pharisees, the middle class, the Essenes, who were sort of pietists, who lived a monastic type of life, and then there were the Zealots, who were ultranationalists. Now, according to our historical tradition, Barabbas was one of these ultranationalist leaders. And when the mob cried for the release of Barabbas, they were stimulated by their idea for freedom from Rome. And Barabbas, to them, represented a guerrilla leader, you know, an underground fighter against...
Popular hero.
A popular hero. This is the way we interpret...
Isn't this often so of any mob, that they don't think, they act on their emotions and instincts, and of course, unconsciously, we become parts of mobs today. With the communications as they are, everybody entering into practically everything that happens by TV or radio, we become a part of a mob, so that misinformation, distorted points of view, half-truths, can set us off with great rapidity.
That's right, and of course the story brings out that it wasn't the mob sitting down and thinking the thing out, that some of the leaders stirred up the people to ask for him instead of Christ, which in a way brings out the famous dictum of Lenin, that revolutions are made by militant minorities. It's the individuals who can control them. However, one of the most beautiful paintings of Christ, Rabbi Levine, that I know of, is one that I came across recently in a book called A Bridge. It's published by the Seton Hall University. Did you ever hear of Marc Chagall?
Oh, yes, he's a very famous Jewish artist.
Well, he painted the crucifixion, and according to this, it may have been the first time in 2,000 years that a Jew painted the story of the crucifixion, which shows this new approach, understanding. And in this particular painting, there is Christ wearing the talis, the Jewish prayer shawl. The artist has laid down his brushes, and to the left of him is a clock, and the hands of the clock have slowly come to 3, the hour that Christ died. And beside him is a sad-faced donkey, the donkey who has so often been mistreated, but perhaps had memories of the kind master who traveled on his back at some particular time. So it brings out in a very special way this new spirit of understanding. In other paintings by Chagall, he has a ladder beside the cross, which to some artists have figured that it may have been for a brother Jew to take his brother down from the cross. But it is a beautiful and, to me, a very heart-moving
It's a lovely
painting of the crucifixion.
This whole affair brings us to a consciousness of our personal responsibility, not only in this act, which goes on day in and day out, but also as individuals in the community, one would wonder what the people of Jerusalem were doing the day of the crucifixion. The indifferent folk who carried on business as usual, that allowed something to take place in their city by ignoring it, by failing to be concerned, maybe by not wanting to get involved.
That's right.
We have folks like that today.
There's one individual in it, Dr. Gosling, that brings out that point of yours very well to me. An individual who didn't want to get involved but became famous as a result. It was the story of this Simon of Cyrene, you know, when they thought Christ was going to die. He was going back into the city to get ready for the Passover, and he met the procession. The last thing he wanted to do was to be involved in it. So the story says they constrained him to take up the cross, given the opportunity to help Christ, which brings out that often when we least expect it, the opportunity presents itself to do something good, to do the virtuous, kindly, helpful thing rather than selfishly to turn down the opportunity, which again brings out the fact that it's a continuing thing.
May I make a comment? You know, as a Jew, this, of course, is a very delicate and very difficult subject to discuss, particularly before Easter. But I think that the spirit that has been expressed here tonight by you, Father Tracy, and by you, Dr. Gosling, and I know that you are expressing the feelings of multitudes of Christians, multitudes, millions of Christians, I'm sure of it, particularly thinking Christians, I think is the most hopeful thing that has happened in many, many years, that we can sit here and discuss this problem with as much feeling of really understanding and really love for one another.
Well, this is the way it should be, and I think that we are all conscious of our own shortcomings. One of G.A. Studdard Kennedy's great poems that I think will live down the years expresses this in a real sense. He says, when Jesus came to Golgotha, they hanged him on a tree. They drave great nails through hands and feet and made a Calvary. They crowned him with a crown of thorns. Red were his wounds and deep, for those were crude and cruel days. The human flesh was cheap. But when Jesus came to Birmingham, they simply passed him by. They never heard a hair of him. They let him die. For men had grown more tender, and they would not give him pain. They only just passed down the street and left him in the rain. Still Jesus cried, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And still it rained, the winter rain, and drenched him through and through, and the crowds went home and left the streets without a soul to see. And Jesus crouched against the wall and cried for Calvary.
Beautiful. What a beautiful thought and beautifully expressed.
Well, maybe we should know that others crucify Jesus day in and day out. So back to you, Don.
Next week at the same time, these three leaders of our major faiths will return to offer their help and share their knowledge as you face your individual challenge. If there are questions in your life or the lives of your family, please address them to Challenge. KOMO TV, Seattle.